In the first half of 2026, the biopharma sector experienced a significant reallocation of capital. Investment moved out of speculative biomedical discovery, pooling instead into late-stage established clinical programs. This shift highlights a tension between foundational intellectual property liabilities and late-stage clinical validations. We need to examine how these two factors empirically drive capital allocation in the post-pandemic sector. To isolate these variables, we are restricting our analysis to empirical market and financial reports from the first and second quarters of 2026. The sheer volume of money moving through the system over these 6 months represents a large-scale realignment of industry resources. This chart shows the primary metric driving the shift: $166.7 billion in announced R&D value during the first half of the year. Breaking down that total, $96 billion came from mergers and acquisitions across 80 deals, while venture funding concentrated on later-stage, de-risked programs. Analyzing this specific half-year dataset reveals exactly how markets value the commercialization of novel modalities beyond infectious diseases. Biopharma valuation is currently described by a theoretical framework, where firms are caught between two opposing financial forces. This diagram illustrates the first force, the innovation premium. This represents the market value generated by successful late-stage clinical trials and novel drug approvals. The second force is the IP liability overhang. This is the financial risk stemming from unresolved patent disputes over foundational delivery platforms. Where these two forces intersect dictates the actual firm valuation. Unresolved IP disputes limit valuation, regardless of how successful the underlying clinical trials might be. From this framework, we can draw two hypotheses. First, on a macro level, capital markets in 2026 prioritize late-stage, de-risked assets over early-stage venture funding. Second, on a micro level, absorbing severe financial penalties to resolve foundational IP disputes serves as the necessary catalyst for platform re-rating and expansion. Markets tend to look past massive short-term financial losses if those losses clear the legal path for highly effective clinical platforms. To operationalize this methodology, we can transition from macro market trends to a firm-level study using Moderna. Under an executive mandate, the company is attempting to transition from a high-burn pandemic startup to a disciplined corporate structure. A paradox emerges when looking at Moderna's Q2 2026 financial dataset. On the surface, the reported numbers appear disastrous. The company reported revenue of $145 million against a staggering GAAP net loss of $782 million, or 1.97 per share. This graph shows the mechanical driver of that loss. While the revenue trend line remains flat, cost of sales spikes 401%, reaching over $1 billion in early 2026. Hidden within this is an $884 million royalty charge, completely unrelated to standard manufacturing. The root cause of this royalty charge is a $2.25 billion global settlement with Genevant Sciences and Arbutus Biopharma. The settlement required an immediate $950 million upfront payment in July 2026 to resolve the unauthorized use of lipid nanoparticle technology. In exchange, Moderna secured a global non-exclusive license to that delivery technology for infectious disease applications. Moderna engineered this massive Q2 net loss to strip away the IP overhang and secure the delivery mechanism necessary for their future vaccines. There is a mathematical gap in the settlement agreement. The $950 million upfront payment leaves $1.3 billion unaccounted for. That remaining $1.3 billion is a contingent payment, entirely dependent on an upcoming appellate ruling regarding a specific federal defense strategy. The defense relies on Title 28 of the U.S. Code, Section 1498, which suggests that patent infringement claims for sales made under government contracts should be directed at the U.S. government, rather than the contractor. To contextualize this defense, we must look back at the origin of these vaccine sales, executed under the federal government's Pandemic Emergency Response Framework. Moderna argued that because the vaccines were produced for the U.S. government, taxpayers should assume the liability for infringing the Genevant and Arbutus patents. The district court rejected this defense, ruling that the vaccines were not strictly limited to government use, thereby keeping the liability on Moderna. The final decision on that $1.3 billion will be made here at the United States Court of Appeals, where the case is under review. The initial $950 million payment provides immediate operational freedom, but a massive $1.3 billion liability still hangs entirely on a judicial interpretation of emergency powers. For Moderna, the financial devastation of the Q2 settlement was the necessary price of entry for their late-stage pipeline. The physiological premise of their next major pivot redirects the mRNA platform away from viruses, using it instead to target individualized tumor mutations. The empirical payoff for this pivot arrived with the Phase 3 INT-PATH-001 trial, evaluating intosimerin autogene combined with Keytruda for resected melanoma. This chart compares the quantitative survival endpoints. The combination therapy showed significantly higher metric outcomes in both recurrence-free survival and distant metastases-free survival than the Keytruda monotherapy alone. This specific data readout marks the first positive Phase 3 result for an mRNA-based individualized neoantigen cancer therapy. Parallel to their oncology work, the company expanded its respiratory portfolio, securing the August 2026 approval of the seasonal flu vaccine mFlusiva for older adults. The vaccine navigated a complex regulatory pathway through the FDA, overcoming an initial refusal to file letter to achieve a dual-track approval that requires post-marketing confirmatory trials. The Q2 financial losses were a direct trade-off for these clinical milestones. Without securing the underlying patent rights, this multimodality expansion would be legally impossible. The theoretical and practical implications of this dataset confirm that the era of generalized pandemic therapeutics has transitioned. The sector is shifting toward targeted biological models, deriving value from targeting individualized disease pathways rather than broad infectious vectors. To support this transition, the courts and Congress must permanently clarify the scope of Section 1498, establishing clear boundaries for intellectual property liability during federal public health emergencies. Additionally, the FDA must standardize its frameworks for accelerated post-marketing confirmatory trials to efficiently handle novel mRNA applications. Regulatory and legal clarity are absolute prerequisites to sustain the influx of capital required for late-stage clinical execution. Returning to the primary empirical finding of the case study, the technological viability of the delivery platform has been secured. mRNA technology has now been empirically validated in Phase 3 trials far beyond infectious diseases. At the macro level, capital markets are systematically rewarding de-risked late-stage execution over speculative early-stage discovery. The core tension of our analysis resolves into a clear sequence. As the visual states, mRNA is validated in oncology, capital demands execution, and resolving IP stabilizes valuation. For Moderna, resolving the legal hurdles of the COVID-19 era provided the stability needed to showcase their oncology data. This suggests that in the 2026 market, clearing foundational IP disputes is a necessary step for companies attempting to transition from pandemic platforms to diversified clinical portfolios.